notwithstanding the slow start of all this technology, I'm not good with it, man.
It's amazing, right? Because on the one hand, I mean, where are you right now? You're in Saudi Arabia?
Yeah.
Yeah, so you and I can do this, which is, unimaginable only, 2-3 years ago?
Yeah.
At the same time, it's kind of a pain in the ass.
Exactly. See, it's like we want to be closer, but then all of a sudden, do we really want to have the baggage that comes with it? Man, it's just...
Yeah. Well, you know what, man? This is, if ever there was proof that there's no such thing as a utopia, I think
Exactly.
we're living proof, man. So
Exactly.
tell me about yourself, man. We've never met, so I'd just love to hear a little
Yeah.
bit more about
So
you, man, and your
I'm
background.
a Saudi researcher. I research Saudi foreign policy towards Israel. So that's my research. So my MA and my PhD, past 10 years basically, I've been researching this topic.
Wow.
It's been very interesting, and it's a very elusive topic. So I began to understand kind of the nuances of it, and began to really see how complex it is. So I was teaching at Essex University in the UK. Spent most of my life in the UK, and I was brought up actually in the United States. So my father was in...
I was going to say, your accent is it's not very British.
No. My father was in the United States, diplomat in the United States. So I was a kid when I was there. That's what made me want to look at foreign policy, Saudi foreign policy in particular.
Your dad was in Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, in the embassy there, Saudi embassy.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was an interesting time. He had a very well-known boss, Prince Bandar, who was pretty known, I think, at the diplomatic circle. And then and so I was very inspired by that. And then so I started teaching at Essex, started studying international relations and teaching at Essex, and then I was a lecturer, and then slowly but surely, I think I found my way to projects of trying to build bridges and mostly peace as well, trying to bring about peace, and that's how I came across Nimrod.
Okay. Yeah. So just for anyone that's listening, Nimrod Novik, who I had on the podcast a couple of weeks ago. But tell me, so when did you leave Washington, D.C.? I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about that place.
1998.
Your dad's 1998. Okay. So that was before 9/11.
Yeah.
Because I think the Saudis rose to prominence in the American broader consciousness only after 9/11, right? I don't think.
Yeah, you know what's interesting about that actually was the plan was, it was very interesting. The plan was to come back home here in Saudi, study. So from 1998, I would have graduated high school 2004. So that makes my age 26 right now. But so from 2004. So and because 9/11 happened, so the plan was, after I graduated high school, I would go back to the US and study, because that's where I was brought up, where I wanted to go. And then because 9/11, as you just mentioned, it was a real difficult time for Saudis. The phrase that people heard were 15 out of the 19, 15 out of the 19 people were Saudi, 15 out of 19 this. And then Saudi was just Saudi was on really that was just a big target. It was on the scope of everyone. And I remember this. I remember then I think then was when we were first introduced to fingerprinting, when we applied for visas. So now it's a natural thing. It's a normal thing. But then just after 9/11, and we had to take fingerprints, and it felt like we were going to prison or something. So
oh wow.
Yeah, it felt real bad. It felt, and then that's when, what's really interesting about it as well, that's when I think Saudis, maybe in the psyche, this is my opinion, we were on the defensive a lot. We were always explaining that, terrorism is not Islam, and those who believe in Islam is not this. And And I wonder, I think I still see remnants of that till now, that people are misunderstanding us, that people are misunderstanding Islam, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So it's very interesting how that is very influential in the psyche, I think, of a lot of Saudis, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But when in 2004, of course, I finished high school, but I think the vibe was still unfriendly, or we interpreted it as unfriendly going to the United States. So that's when I went to the United Kingdom, and I went to Sandhurst and there and studied. I went to actually did officer training there at Sandhurst.
Oh wow.
Yeah, and
Okay. So
before I
actually, that's you raise an interesting issue that I'm curious, and I think a lot of people
yeah
with my background would be curious to know about. I know nothing about Saudi Arabia,
yeah
and I'm just curious what when you experience this shift in of what popular awareness of Saudi Arabia, or sort of identifying Saudi Arabia with radical and extremist Islam. Why is that untrue? Why? Just give me a sort of a
yeah.
crash course on what
It's a
life
real
is
good
like in
point.
Saudi Arabia.
Well, firstly, I'll start off with this. There's a lot of Orientalism and there's a lot of misunderstanding, and as you alluded to in your question, one of the first point is that a lot of people don't know or realize how much we've been a target to terrorists as well here in Saudi.
Right.
So I remember in the beginning. So I remember I used to even visiting Saudi when I was living in the States, and I remember in the summer of '96, there was a Dhahran bombing, and it was done by, I think there was a group really called Hezbollah of Saudi Arabia. And so there were that was another terrorist kind of organization. Then Al Qaeda had committed these explosions in 1995. But I think what was the thing that I remember very vividly was in 2003. They kind of began a wave of terrorism from 2003 to 2009, and a lot of people don't know. I mean, don't know this. Now, the question for me is, why don't people don't know this? Is it because the narrative is too strong, that people are just saying, no, this is precisely okay, Saudi Arabia equals terrorism. No, Saudi Arabia equals an interesting relationship with terrorism. I don't know. They used to support the Mujahideen, like the United States did, by the way, in Afghanistan, and so we don't know. But actually, one of the things that I think about, and I'm kind of self-critical a lot of the times, is I wonder what we could have done better to explain to the world, what we have gone through. And this illustrates really the aspect of narrative. Whose narrative is gaining traction in kind of in the world streets, and if you like. So
So,
you know
but break that
yeah
illusion for me for a second, right? Because you said that from 2003 to 2009 there was this wave of I'm assuming radical Islamic terrorism inside of Saudi Arabia. So who were the targets of that violence? Like where do you see the divide between the popular imagination of Saudis who chop off the hands of
yeah
thieves and
yeah
don't let women drive and all this kind of stuff, that I think these are the images that most people,
yeah
even myself, we have of Saudi Arabia. And so yeah, so make sense of that for me if you can.
yeah sure. No, so these people, they were recruited. And Saudi has also had a history of tackling terrorism for a while, even from the 70s. It stems back even from the 70s. And they were recruited
Yeah.
because there was a great deal of social and religious conservatism that kind of steers off sometimes and could get recruited by these terrorist organizations. Now, the fact is, or the interesting part is that the terrorists look exactly alike like other people, and that's where the conflation happens. So you have these terrorists with really long beards and kind of the shamar that they wear, But at the same time, plenty of religious scholars who are condemning them and kind of extracting and tackling their arguments from a theological point of view and delegitimizing their theological justification for this terrorism look exactly the same. You know what I'm saying? So there's this aspect that, okay, there's a bearded person, there's a wearing a shemagh, so that the regalia that we wear, and it's interesting. So the black part is, you could tell from someone who's religious who doesn't wear the black circle around their head, because it signifies like prosperity, and these people are like more of the people of the afterlife. And, you know, it's an interesting thing. So it's a sign of religious kind of piety, and therefore when people see them, they all look alike. They all, what is this? Now they may be all conservative, but politically, they're completely at odds. And this is the problem. And I think it was just too. It required a lot of effort, but I'll be very honest with you. It required an open mind from others to understand that, listen, these people are not alike.
Right.
And just like how I think one of our foreign ministers, or Minister of Foreign Affairs, Adil Jaber, once said, you know, it's just like, you know, would we consider you, would we consider the KKK emblematic or representative of American society? Well, they look alike. Right. They look like a lot of other people too. You know, but it won't be fair. It's a wrong synonym. It's a wrong conflation. And that's the problem that we struggled with. And I think we still struggle with that a lot of the times.
Yeah, and there's actually some similarities that I think about it with amongst Jews as well. That you know, the difference between a secular Jew and a religious Jew is it's an emphasis on belief, but a lot of the practices are really the same, right? And that and yet you have this, but that difference is I mean, just for example, in this country before this war, it was basically tearing the country apart. So that phenomenon of, you know, being, as you said, right, you have conservative Muslims, right, across the board, and yet there's this political, perhaps even theological divide that's so sharp, even though the similarities are far outweigh, at least in terms of number, right, the way they behave, certainly the way they behave, and yet that's just justification to, you know, to impart some of the worst violence, or even more, let's say, vicious arguments against each other. So it's interesting. Humans, we humans are a special bunch.
we don't like to use what God gave us sometimes. We don't we don't like to use it to the full maximum. We need to use it more. We need to use it more.
I think it was Robin Williams who said, this joke's probably not going to land too well, but he said, God gave us a penis. God gave man a penis and a brain, and only enough blood to use one at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. There you go. There you go. Tells you.
But okay, so then you moved to the UK just because crazily somehow America was not a hospitable place to be a Saudi.
It was,
but UK was.
It's a good point. I think for me it was the. It's a real good point, because that was the perception that we had. That was the perception that we had. I mean, I was 18. I still had to listen to my dad. Still have to listen to my dad. But I mean, you know, so he was the boss, and he wasn't very happy with it. He wasn't very comfortable with it. I remember I went to the US the year before, and people, because it was Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia, it was more of a metropolitan place. And so therefore, you know, it was more, I'm sure, I don't know if you've been there or not, you know, around Washington, D.C., but you know,
I live there.
Oh, okay, there you go. So we both lived there. So it was an acceptable, you know, a more of a hospitable place, but the procedures weren't welcoming. The procedures made us feel like we were not welcome. And, you know, the fingerprinting.
And also Northern Virginia, if I'm not mistaken, that's a lot of military and intelligence agencies. Like
Yeah,
all that's situated more or less
yeah,
in that area headquarters.
yeah,
So you're dealing with a lot of people who are digging into, let's say, your country and
yeah.
folks
Well,
operating in that.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, exactly. I mean, we were very close to Langley. We were very close to
yeah,
CIA Langley, CIA headquarters. So, but I mean, but it was the
yeah.
procedures, I think, that made it not very hospitable. So it was like we had to
Hmm.
constantly go check in every, I think, month or so, or every semester, if one needed to go to be a student. We needed to, do these
Mm.
things that are actually normal now, but they were incredibly abnormal then. And it made us feel like, wow, what is this? So when I did go to the UK, that was a very interesting experience, and it was a culture shock. Was very fascinating because it wasn't a culture shock between,
Really?
yeah, because from the Saudi, it wasn't a culture shock from the Saudi culture and the British culture. It was a culture shock from the American culture that I have, and the British culture. And going to a very British institute, in the UK, um, like high fiving wasn't really a thing, for example. I would get, I would get, I remember, this is gonna sound really fun. God bless him, my sergeant major. And then he said once, he's like, "Oh, you got a problem, Mr. Aziz?" And he's like, "Yeah, what is it, sir?" And then he was like, "You talk too much, too American." And I was like, "Well, how am I too American? How is that?" And then, and then he said, "You don't say sir, you say yes, sir." And that's just way too much. That's just unacceptable.
Mm.
That's just not.
Okay.
So and I was like, "What the hell is this?" What, this is very interesting. So it
Mm.
it was an interesting experience. And then being, of course, in the UK, and then I stayed, what, a good 11 years or so. No, I haven't gone to the
Mm.
US in 7 years, and I went there, visited once in 2014. I felt like, wow, this is where this is. Yeah, now I see what people were saying about me. That, okay, you're very social, you're very talkative,
Mm.
you're very, bit, open, and just laid back a bit. And then, yeah, so I remember
Yeah.
that. Yeah, so that was the
And
interesting.
I imagine also, I imagine also, especially in the sort of more educated elite
Yeah.
institutions in the UK, that they have more exposure to. I mean, they were a global empire, right? And they had
Mm,
what plenty of experience in the Middle East. That they guys like you, you're one of several nationalities that have
yeah,
made their way to the UK. I mean, there's
I
just
agree.
you
Yeah,
can pick any flavor you want, right?
yeah. It was a very interesting part. I mean, uh, I went. So this Sandhurst, there was a very interesting. It was a military academy. It was where Prince Harry and Prince William did their training,
Hmm.
and I was actually there when they were there, which is a
Didn't
very fun.
also didn't did, didn't also MBZ go there?
Yes, yes, yeah,
Okay.
yeah. He went there. He did
Wait,
his
and you
training.
you said Prince Harry and Prince William?
Yeah, yeah. I was there when they were there.
Okay, I have to ask. So what was that like?
Yeah, that was a very interesting experience. So I didn't interact with them much, but I remember because the course is 3 terms, and in a year you have 3 different courses. So obviously, so you have 3 different intakes, they would call it. Okay, so Prince Harry was the intake before me, and then I came, and then Prince William was the intake after me. So we used to interact sometimes. And I mean, if you tell them that, they don't know who the hell Aziz is, But I remember, but everyone knew who they were. So I remember even playing football either sometimes, and it was weird. It was a weird experience because um, it was there was some security, and then but Prince William Harry, for example, was very to himself. He was, he was, yeah, it seemed like he was very suspicious of everyone, and he just didn't,
Mm.
he was very to himself. William was you could tell, I think he understood the position that he has, so he was a bit hello, hi, and it was very, it wasn't, I, I remember that. I remember that person. I remember because I remember
Yeah.
once, it's going to sound really funny, man. I don't know what the hell I was thinking, but he was walking down and I was walking up, and I remember he was supposed to be, his term was supposed to be on the other side of the place. They were doing drill and practicing something. So he had an excuse,
Okay.
obviously, to go. Wow, and I just started. I'm like, let me just stare him down. Let me just look at him and make him feel awkward. I don't know what it is. So he looked at me, and I wanted to say, aren't you supposed to be there? But we were walking really fast past each other. So he was like, hello, hi, and I was like, yeah, what's up? And then, so that was a weird experience. It was, it was a weird experience. It was a weird experience.
Okay.
Yeah.
How did you feel after you stared down the future king of England?
Just like how, just like 5 minutes before, it was, it didn't mean, it was pretty, it Aziz is Aziz, didn't change.
That's funny. Oh
Yeah,
my
yeah,
gosh. Yeah, well, listen, I mean, he at least knows, knew back then that the path that his life was going on, right?
yeah,
Whether he was cool with it or not is,
yeah,
but the other dude, Harry, I mean,
yeah.
what
He was,
what's he gonna do? Like his whole life, his whole existence is I'm the brother of. Like
yeah,
he can't do anything. No wonder
yeah,
they go crazy. The number
yeah,
twos.
yeah, yeah. They got some issues. I don't know what it is, man. I don't go into it, but I mean, exactly. I agree. It's just, I think, I
So
mean,
that's
his book is interesting. I think I read his book a little. I think I bought it, but I didn't read it that much. But it's spare, and you
yeah.
probably know the term, like, why they were there is that, okay, just in case the the heir to the throne dies, there's another spare. So, his entire life was kind of viewed as, this little, you're the backup, you're, this kind of person.
Yeah.
And so I
Yeah.
think it just affected him, poor guy.
But that, I mean, so you went from the US to that environment. And
Yeah.
who are the kinds of who are the kinds of people that go to Sandhurst? I mean, these are
Yeah.
obviously future monarchs, but who else? What is the point of this institution? What do they
This is,
produce?
well, they make British Army officers and Army officers
Hmm.
abroad. So militaries abroad send their their students there to train, and I wanted to go, so I
Okay.
ended up signing up. But it's one of the misconceptions of this idea of, like, Sandhurst, because it's very prestigious or anything like that, is that only the elite and wealthy and the aristocracy kind of go there, and that wasn't the case.
Hmm.
Uh, there's a great deal of people that were down to earth, um, literally,
Mm.
even former soldiers, even former soldiers that
Mm.
used to be serving in the British military. They would go there, and they would be selected because of their leadership potential, etc. And so you had a real
Yeah.
wide array of people. They had the same characteristics, I have to say. They had the same. They were, because we were all young, full of testosterone, except for the ladies, of course. So they probably had testosterone too. I don't know, but I mean, they were there,
Okay.
and uh, they were very spiky. It was a spiky environment. It was an
Okay.
environment where everyone wanted to impose their ego and show their ego.
Mm.
It was one of
Hmm.
these kind of places where everyone kind of wanted to show, okay, no, they're the leaders here. No, I'm the leader here. No, they're the bigger one. And so you have a lot of
Mm-hmm.
jostling in between. And I was a young kid. I was young and naive. I was a 19-year-old, and and then you have these, like, 24-year-olds, 25, 28-year-olds. You know what I'm saying? And it
Oh
was it
wow.
was a, yeah, yeah, it was a challenging environment for me also to protect myself. But so but it was good because I learned a lot. You learn how to how to you know, you learn a lot of things. You learn that leadership is really, you can't fake leadership, you know, and you gotta, there is no booklet for leadership. You gotta be who you are, you know, and you gotta embrace who you are, because that was one of the things that I saw there, is that probably too many people were trying to speak in a particular way, act like in a particular way that weren't them, and the leaders among them were themselves. You know, the leaders among them were
Yeah.
themselves. So that was on the British
Yeah.
side. The overseas cadets, which I was one of them. It was very interesting. So you had a range, mostly from the British Empire. From the British Empire, they were, you know, from countries from that ranged from, I think, Malaysia, Senegal, Gambia. You know, a lot of from the Gulf, from the GCC, Jordan. A friend of mine was from Egypt, and then there's good old Aziz from Saudi. And I remember there was one. God bless her. She started working in Sandhurst like in the 1950s. So God bless her. She died recently. But she used to look after the overseas cadets. And then she used to be like the mother of the overseas cadets. And no one said no to her. She just walked in anywhere and she would be like, "Oh, okay, Margaret is here." I remember it was Margaret. And she said, "This is the thing about the problem with overseas cadets in here at Sandhurst, is that they either had too much money, just like the royalty and the princes that would go there, or they didn't have enough money." So, like, you know, and so it would always cause a problem, and it was always different, like, you know, the overseas cadets and how people dealt with the overseas cadets. And there was this legacy also that overseas cadets are lazy, or they didn't do this, or they, you know, they tried to find the easy way out. Can't say none of it is true, but you know, but it's I mean, it was interesting to see how because some of these overseas cadets, especially from, like, for example, from Oman, there was one guy from Oman. I remember him. He was called Ahmed. He was an older guy. He was a corporal in his in his military, and his English wasn't that good. It was all right, but his English wasn't that good. My English was okay. I was brought up in the States, but my military understanding was still I was learning. So I remember I went there, and he sat next to me once in one of the lectures, and he looked up and he's like, "What is that? What is that?" And I'm like, you know, I translated it almost literally. It was something. They had a lot of acronyms in the British military. It was like CLAP, for example. So remember this: when you give orders, you have to clap, clear, loud, as an order, pause, and then you have beckon. What the hell does that mean? I don't know. Upsa. You know, I don't know. So those are these weird things, but I remember clap. So they had one of these acronyms, and I said it's an acronym of, I don't know, some kind of firing or maneuver. And then he said, "Oh, it's this, that, this, and he named it. It was like 13. And I look up, I remember it, and I was like, "Holy shit, this guy got it all." You know, and I was like, "Man, this guy." So these overseas cadets, a lot of them, they're just fantastic, man. They were really well trained. Some of them were incredibly fit. I mean, they were incredibly fit. I did a lot of push-ups, but no, running wasn't my thing, man. Running wasn't my thing, but I did a lot of push-ups. But that's about it.
But was the point of sending these guys from, let's say, the Gulf or just the general the Africa and other countries
You know
that are
what's
less
interesting?
developed, is that these guys there to come back and lead the military?
Yeah,
Like what is the point of sending?
So they train there. So this is part of the relationship that I think the US has. I'm sorry, the UK has, and even the US. So the US has West Point, where they also send people to train there, and then they come back, and then they train of course, they're they become lieutenants here, and they become officers here, and they become American trained or British trained, and it serves a lot of purposes
Hmm.
for us. For people that send them, I think they get good training, good exposure, and then they get they then become potentially officers that deal with the foreign element of the foreign policy, I would say, of the
Mm.
military side of things. They could become military attaches. They become people that get sent off on delegations, etc. For
Hmm.
the British hosts, they not only do they get paid because it's not for free, but
Hmm.
uh, it's um, it's a form of soft power. Also, that this person then becomes someone that views us probably better than others. Someone could tell how good the training was. There's an image aspect to
Yeah.
this. It's easier to connect with them later on. And I think more directly, they get funded a lot. So at Sandhurst, for example, you have a lot of buildings named after Gulf leaders, Arab leaders, um, um,
Hmm.
Malaysian leaders, and they build up. They build up the place. So I remember, for example, there was a sports hall called the Oman Hall. So obviously, because the Sultan of Oman, the previous one, Qaboos, he trained there.
Hmm.
So and then he had to maintain that relationship.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So King
Yeah.
Hussein Pavilion, King Hussein of Jordan. So King Hussein Pavilion of cricket. So he built it up there. So I
Hmm.
wondered, I was like, what's going on here? So there's clearly part of this relationship and soft power kind of aspect that is taking place between.
Yeah. And when you said something about leadership, about, and also about being yourself, like leadership is also, I would argue, is about the things that you learn in that kind of a setting, right? Which is discipline and self-control and just and abiding by the values, whatever that your society upholds. If it's fairness, if it's courage, if it's honesty, and that kind of stuff. Which is in properly functioning militaries, those are the things that are held to the highest standard, right?
Mm,
If you're not, if you're a military and you're not disciplined, and you don't practice courage and you don't practice selflessness, you're
yeah,
fucked, right?
absolutely.
You're just going to completely fall apart.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And so having that shared ethos and then exporting that around the world, who are to people who hopefully in theory, right, lead
yeah,
major institutions in the country, maybe in the entire country period, or
yeah,
like someone like an MBZ, for example.
yeah,
Yeah, you're right. I mean, there's quite a lot of value for the UK in that, having that deep shared bond that in this very, what's the word, like in this period of your life where you're being developed at such a
yeah.
rate. So it makes sense. So and what'd you do after when you left Sandhurst?
So and then I went to university. I went to the university. I've always wanted to go, and I began to study international relations and developed this
Okay.
idea of foreign of foreign policy, and I loved kind of Saudi foreign policy. I was I was I wasn't a brilliant writer. I was just too eager to understand the policies and the politics, and so when they were teaching us, for
Yeah.
example, theories of international relations, I wasn't overly keen on looking at that. Then I realized how important theory is, and etc. later on. But so I
Okay.
stayed 3 years in Nottingham, United Kingdom. Um, Not 3 years there. That 3 years for my BA.
What is Saudi foreign policy? I have no idea what that looks like.
Well, Saudi foreign policy. This is if I could put it up in a nutshell. If I could put it in a nutshell,
Yeah.
Saudi foreign policy. In one of the things that I look at is how it balances between very difficult decisions and very difficult positions. So it balances its interests historically that it needed from the United States, from the West, from others, with its conservative identity. That because
Hmm.
Saudi Arabia is not only a religiously conservative country where it hosts the two holy mosques, its legitimacy, its social contract is based on religion. It's based on
Hmm.
the relationship between the covenant between religion and politics between Muhammad bin Saud and Muhammad Abdul Wahab in 1744, I believe, where they said, okay, this could be a state, but it would be governed by religious principles, by Islamic principles, by basically Sharia. And so the legitimacy of the state derives from religion, as well as other aspects, but religion is the center. And so how can you balance this with the challenges of the 20th century? And Saudis kind of had to balance this, its relations with the United States, this country that is viewed, okay, as not the godless Soviet Union, which was viewed bad, but also this kind of beacon of modernity, and I won't say even beacon of modernity, beacon of this of the beacon, I would say, of immorality, almost, of life, of living, of this hyper liberal world. This is kind of the sense sometimes that people had. And I remember even when I used to live here, this is how people viewed the United States and the West, as an incredibly overly liberal people with no principles and no, this is kind of the problem that we have. Because to be very honest, just like how there is an Orientalist perspective on how people viewed us, and that we're very backward people, we're either extremists or there is also an Occidentalism, how we viewed the West also.
Right.
This has to be mentioned, and so Saudi had to balance its relations, balance its interests, and with its legitimacy. And therefore, how do they balance it? And this is one of the things that I've looked at, and either making their positions very interesting, very elusive, through language. Language was kind of the instrument of trying to maintain this balancing position, by sometimes saying things a little bit vaguely, sometimes not saying the entire truth, but not lying, sometimes adhering to different audiences at the same time. This is what's really fascinating. So Saudi, in my opinion, what if I could encapsulate Saudi foreign policy, is that Saudi is always in a constant state of balance. It's balancing between different interests. It's balancing between different audiences. It's balancing between different needs. And so this is one of the things that I wanted to develop. And when I developed this, so I looked at this kind of idea of Saudi foreign policy towards how does it balance between its relations with Syria, which is kind of part of the axis, anti-American axis, and its relations with the US. It was actually during that time in my BA that I said, hold on, wait a minute. Let me look at this. I think Saudi Arabia and Israel they have a lot of interest, mutual interest. And if I was to take, and then I said this, and I remember the moment I did this, and I said, if I could just take Israel out of the sentence and put Saudi Arabia in to describe its regional situation, an international situation, security situation, I would say, yeah, that actually makes sense. You can't say, well, Iran faced a threat from Hezbollah. That doesn't make sense. It doesn't. But Iran, Saudi Arabia faced a threat from Hezbollah. I could take Saudi Arabia, put Israel in. It was like Israel faced a threat. Okay. And then I did that on the Saudi front. So I said, took Saudi Arabia out and put Israel in. And I said, this actually looks interesting. Why? I wanted to then broaden that. And that's when I began with my MA to really look at this kind of Saudi-Israeli interests and their commonalities. And that's really what began my research these years on Saudi foreign policy towards Israel.
So I have a few questions about that specific, but before we get into that, I'm curious about, you mentioned the parallel between Saudi Arabia and Israel, but is Islam does have this, correct me if I'm wrong, does have this tendency towards expand empire building, essentially,
Mm.
right? There's the Dar al Harb, right? The Dar al Islam and the Dar al Harb, right? So the realm of Islam and then the realm of war, right? Or the realm of the infidel and things like this. Does Saudi Arabia, given its importance in Islam, and as you said, the Islamic anchor to its society and its authority as the ruling family, do they have ambitions to extend the empire? I mean, how do they view their authority and just empire building in general and that tendency
This
in
is
Islam?
this is a very, very important question. This is a very good question. And one of the things that I came across of was this idea of Dar al-Harb, the sphere of war and the sphere of peace, etc. Is that it's not clear where this is derived from the Sharia. This seems to be an interpretation that came out later on, and this connection has been is somewhat opaque and vague. This is my perception as someone who looked at the role of Islam in Saudi foreign policy. Because this is a theological question, and it's also a political question when it comes to foreign policy. So forgive me for my limitation on that particular thing, but what I came across was that, firstly, it was a different kind of the link to it. I remember coming across the works of that Dar al-Harb, Dar al-Islam. It wasn't very clear where that was inspired from in the original text. But secondly, when it comes to Saudi Arabia, I think, and how does Saudi view this, it's a real complex issue, because I think when it comes to Saudi is more of a status quo state. It's because of its size. So this is now a political aspect. Because of its size, it cannot afford to think in expansionist terms. And therefore,
why not?
Because it'll be overstretched. I mean, if you look at Saudi Arabia geographically, with its population, it's very, very overstretched. It's not a country that it's very difficult to man and protect the borders, and as a result, thinking expansionistly is not in its strategic interest. And as a result, that's why a lot of the times when you look at, for example, the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when it was expansionist, Saudi, whenever there were kind of attacks or anything, Saudi kind of defended its borders, but then never went on the offense. They always tried to maintain the status quo. They always tried to maintain. They were always in a defensive position, and therefore, this idea of maybe having Saudi to expand its borders or etc. This militarily speaking, I don't think that they can't afford to do that. Now, theologically, this is something that's actually very interesting, because spreading the word of Islam or preaching is something that I think they have done historically.
Right.
And this is where a lot of people have problems with Saudi. That Saudis themselves, they would invest in sending scholars, opening schools, trying to spread and adhere to the belief, which is required to propagate, or not, I won't say propagate, but adhere and spread the word of God, etc. Now, what's very fascinating was that was the reason why my dad went to the United States. So my dad went there
to
yeah. So my dad went there.
Proselytize.
Yeah. So my dad went there in the mid '80s to open an office in the Saudi embassy that was called the Islamic to be an Islamic attaché. So to work from the Islamic attache's office. So he was here. He did his PhD in religious jurisprudence, and when he did his PhD in religious jurisprudence, he came back to the university. He did it in Cairo. He went back to the university. here in Saudi. And when he went to the university, they were looking for people to then open up, to spread kind of Islam and the teachings of Islam correctly, or at least in the way Saudi views as correct. So that's where he went, and he went there. And now a lot of people, because of this spreading, etc., viewed this as, oh, you're spreading terrorism, or you're spreading an Islamist kind of teachings around, and this is where it becomes really conflated and opaque, because I think the same people that were saying bad things about the West and how awful the West is, they were saying the same thing about Saudi. They were the same people. This is what was very interesting. And this goes back to your first question that you asked: who are these people? Who did they target? The terrorism that were here. The terrorists that were here in Saudi, when they used to target Saudi officials. So they would target American bases, Western bases, and their collaborators, their Saudi collaborators. So they were viewed. We were viewed as legitimate targets. The Saudi government was viewed as a legitimate target. Even our Ministry of Interior was targeted. Even there's something that really doesn't know. The former Interior Minister had survived a suicide bombing. There was a suicide bomber that went there and met him, and he was from Al-Qaeda of the Arabian Peninsula that was based in Yemen. And I remember there was a phone conversation, and then they kind of spoke and said, I want to meet you, and I want to talk to you, and I want to, they were kind of negotiating and trying to bring the cell back and form, and negotiating kind of their return, and in exchange for no more violence, etc. So I think it came back, and he said, I want to go talk to you, I want to meet you. And then he did. And then once he was there, he connected to people in Yemen. And once they were talking on the phone, he said, hello, how are you? The guy detonated the bomb while they're sat next to each other. But I think the suicide bomber had the bomb really inside of him, too deep inside of him, that it actually protected, I think, acted as a buffer. So the former Interior Minister, wow. So we suffered from terrorism. This is what a lot of people kind of don't see. And so the same people that are saying
he was negotiating.
Yeah,
the guy was negotiating the place of his own suicide. That's nuts.
Yeah, he was saying.
But tell me, your dad.
Yeah,
your dad came to the U.S. to teach about Islam, to convert people. Like for example, I could go to a university and take a course on Islam.
Yeah.
No one would accuse the teacher of saying that he or she is trying to convert people into the faith. But was your dad's mission to convert people, or your dad was sort of there to just say, look, guys, you want a clean version of what we stand for? I'm here to explain to you. No, I'm not trying to sell you anything. Like, what was he trying to do?
No, that's a good point. So he was in an office that oversaw that. He oversaw that project. He wasn't himself kind of someone who spoke and preached. So he oversaw the project of this education, I would say, of Islam, Sunni Islam, of education, and enter into the discussion and enter into the debate in the world platform, on the world stage. And it wasn't just him. I mean, there were others also all around the world that was part of this project that King Fahd then had. Now, what's very fascinating was that I'll tell you a story. So as you said, in 9/11 happened, and then all of a sudden Islam and this was at the front and center. There was something that the FBI saw that made them realize that, okay, actually this project isn't to be that helped their reputation, I would say. Now, I'll tell you what happened. So a few years ago, a few years before 9/11, my dad was in his office, and then he told me this, and then he received a delegation, a Christian delegation, I think from some church, and it was
Mm-hmm.
it was the priest and a few nuns, very respectful, and then he had someone come up and he said, uh, there are people downstairs, and he said, oh, fantastic, okay, where are they? And it's like, all right, so they came in, and he invited them in, and I think also they prepared some lunch, and they said, all right, that's fine, we'll put some lunch for you, and he hosted them, and then they said, listen, we understand we're all a people of the book, and our church is struggling financially. We would like some financial assistance. And then he said, I think, yeah, no problem. How much was it? It was something like $15,000 or something like that. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
But then my father said, yes, okay, sure. Yeah, we're very happy to do this. Listen, we're not here to try to convert you. We're not here to try to revert you. We're all here to be a good society living together. This was the message that he sent them.
Mm-hmm.
That we're all here to being part of that, and to just contribute together. And then my father said, hold on, wait. So he said they were kind of expecting my father to say, well, what are you going to do for us? And then they sat
Mm-hmm.
and that's it. So you're going to give us the money? There's no strings attached here. He said, there isn't. We're here not to convert people. We're here to be part of a proper society. And they were very happy about that. They then said, listen, you guys, what you guys need, whenever you guys need from our church, we will allocate a slot for you every Friday where you could have a sermon, you could talk, you could give a speech, you could host a lecture. That church in the cathedral, that we will allocate that for you. So here was an example of in this interfaith exchange
Mm.
was on a strategic level. It was on a strategic level, and they were traveling. They were supporting building mosques. They were supporting interfaith kind of discussions, and that was what they tried to preach. That was what they tried to preach. Now you have some idiots here and there that you guys have them in Israel. They have them in the U.S. We have them. We have all around. You're gonna have extremists and fools everywhere, and fools can be very liberal as well. Fools can be very secular as well. And it's not like fools are only exclusively
Yeah.
religious. you know. So that was one of the stories.
Yeah.
I think I remember my dad was then back here, and then when 9/11 happened, people came and saw, and they were like, "Whoa, all right, what is this $20,000 or $15,000?" And he's like, "Well, it went to the church."
Hmm.
And it's like, oh, okay. So that then began to understand, okay, there isn't this organized thing from the Saudi government or the Saudi embassy that we're supporting people. They're like, well, if we're really worried about them, why would they support the church? So that was something how it later on, look at how it paid off, or what it said. And so this was the philosophy that they had. So when my dad was there, he was there, and I was very interested in foreign policy because of that.
But I mean, if I'm thinking, if I take that story just as a micro example of a bigger
Mm.
strategy, because I doubt that the Saudis would spend any resources on such a project as that your dad led without expecting some kind of benefit in return. Now that's really cool that you have
Yeah.
good relations between churches and the Islamic community, and to then say, look, they gave us this check, no strings attached, and we're reciprocating and say, like, come talk to our community, so we have a better, like, that's all fantastic, right? And I think that's what you want, I think, in
Yeah.
between countries. So I think
Yeah.
that's good. And as I don't say this cynically, but I do think that that's a great strategy to then say, look, we're a country, we're complicated. We have, as you said, right, we have to make very difficult decisions. So we have to balance between a whole bunch of forces. We're in a very tough neighborhood, and we're also just people just like you, and you've met us, you've broke bread with us on Fridays, and
Yeah.
you've heard us, and we gave you money, and we're not here to ask you for much other than to just treat us as basically like you, right? So I think it's actually it's a very sophisticated way of breaking down, although it doesn't seem to have worked, right? If you just ask, if you just poll any random American and say, what do you think about the Saudis?
Yeah.
Especially with, MBS and the Khashoggi thing, like that, like if you just take a random American or anyone from the West and you just pluck them out of the street and say, what do you think about that? It's like, well, you see what they did to Khashoggi. There was also another documentary, I can't remember, about how the Saudis were using NSO to spy on everyone or something, but which of course the Saudis weren't the only ones to do it.
Yeah.
And let's not be naive, right? Every country uses this very similar technology to do the same. Yeah. Anyway, it's interesting, but okay, so
it is. No, I'm sorry to interrupt your point, but
no, go for
it. This you mentioned a very interesting point, because Saudi has always had an uphill battle with its image.
Mm-hmm.
This is very, very salient, and this is one of the things that one of the themes of Saudi foreign policy also was that, okay, our image, we're always perceived negatively. We're always perceived sometimes for fair points, a lot of times not for fair points. And this is where it becomes very dangerous. When you start to engage with why this misperception is there, you start to really realize that no information is bad, but little information is very dangerous. And you have a narrative of, okay, what do you hear about this country? And you have Khashoggi, you have 9/11, and you have it's bound to be negative.
Right.
It's bound to be negative.
Yeah.
It's bound to be negative. It's the same thing as perhaps Israel. I mean,
it's absolutely Israel.
Yeah, and it's Israel, where there's the occupation, IDF, and this. For me, I think, as someone who has dealt with Israelis, worked with Israelis. Listen, okay, Israel has a lot of things to offer: technology, tech, etc. But in my opinion, the strongest thing that Israel has, it's civil society. For me personally, I just very much appreciate the civil society, the honesty, the diversity, the bravery of some of these people that were willing to stand and say, okay, our principal position is here. So people don't see that. And I think when it comes to the context of the war now, and people like you mentioned, Nimrod, who was in your on your episode before, and others, I never say, for example, Israel has done this or Israel has done that. I either say, the Netanyahu government done this, and the Netanyahu, because I know this is not a representation of this, because I also know how it feels like to be lumped up all together. Osama bin Laden, the Saudi Arabian business first, and he's originally not Saudi Arabian, by the way. The bin Laden family bin Laden family originated from Yemen, and when they originated from Yemen, so you're talking about a while ago, they kind of then went to the Hijaz region, which is Mecca, and that was also a lot of the trade that used to happen, because that was kind of the road that they used to take, or the path or the journey that they used to take, and therefore a lot of very wealthy Saudi businessmen that are based in Western Saudi Arabia are originally from Yemen. So a lot of the times they're just lumping everyone up that looks alike. That so we all have something in common, which is the way we are being depicted. And I just had a discussion yesterday, actually, with a friend of mine from Israel, and we were talking about how can we move on? How can we not move on? How can we proceed with a project with getting voices together, addressing the issues that we have, addressing two-state solution, addressing this problem. A lot of people from outside say, "Oh no, it's dead, it's gone," but people from the region are saying, "Well, that's the only option we have." For councils. Well, but and what was very fascinating was my time in the UK. Sure, it's happening in the US, but in my time in the UK, when I was entering into these Palestinian-Israeli debates and discussions, most of the discussions and debates were being dictated by people that are not either Israeli nor Palestinian nor Arab.
Right.
It was basically people that were abroad talking about us the way they want to talk about us because of their domestic politics.
Yeah.
Your domestic
It feels a bit like they're analyzing a football game that
Yes.
Israelis and Palestinians are playing, but
Yes.
none of us are we're participating
Exactly.
in this game. Like, bro,
Exactly.
maybe you should have one of us on.
Yeah, exactly. Precisely. Honestly, and it's I remember this, man. I remember this. So I remember once there was like a there was like a Palestinian group, the Palestinian Solidarity Society. And they had their issues there, and they were talking about, okay, what could we do? What could we do? And I was saying, listen, we have to start being a bit, not about shouting and screaming, and we have to be a bit, more sophisticated than this. And we have to, start saying, okay, invite people here to talk, invite people. This isn't about screaming and shouting and slogans and everything. There's a time for that. And everyone was like, no, we're, except for the Palestinian woman that was the leader of the Palestinian. She was the only person that said, no, that's what we need. Everyone else that came from lots of other different places, they were like, no, go, scream, shout, fantastic. Let's do this. And this is what made me say, it's like, listen, we need to have this agency where Arabs, Israelis, Palestinians, Egyptians, North Africans, whoever they are, we need to start really having more agency, a community where we're talking about the same principles, where we share the same principles, and really start saying, listen, don't start narrating who we are. We can narrate ourselves.
So I love this, man, because I don't really like to talk about it so much, but I do actually sometimes think that if you just switch your eyes for a second and your viewpoint of the world, like right now things look pretty bad. We have this war, and as you said, right, a lot of people around the world say the two-state solution is dead, and it's just a never-ending conflict. And I think if you also just look at the opportunities that are available to us now, like just for example, we have now the possibility to broadcast conversations between so-called adversaries, right? Where we can discuss things in such a manner, and the potential is limitless, right? I mean, the audience is, you can reach millions, tens of millions of people. I'm not saying that this specific conversation will, but the potential is there.
Yep.
And if you think about just how influence works, because essentially this conflict is really about, I mean, it's always been called the conflict of narratives, right? That the Israelis are telling themselves a story that is completely incompatible with the stories that the Palestinians are telling themselves, and that the Israelis are telling themselves a story that's completely incompatible with Iran and Hezbollah and perhaps much of the Muslim world. And yet, if it comes down to stories, right, and then those stories can be influenced and massaged and tweaked to such an extent that the stories are not incompatible anymore, and that we start breaking down the differences through this iterative process of conversations, that we can actually get somewhere, and rather quickly. Now that's obviously the best case scenario, but the potential is there, right? Absolutely. We just have to grab it and seize it. So I'm with you, man, and I'm trying to do my small part, but
I appreciate you, man. I appreciate you. That's why I'm happy to go on. That's why I was happy. That's why, and I believe. and you're right. And it's like, listen, we don't have to agree on everything, but at least agree on the principle, at least agree on the horizon, at least agree on the fact that just because you are one thing, it doesn't mean you're against another. And just like, and that's one thing that I spoke to with the Palestinian solidarity group there, and that's hopefully they got that at the end. They were like, you know what, we're going to be, and this is the credit to them, they listen, we're going to be a pro-Palestinian group, but it doesn't mean it's an anti-Israel group. And I said, see, this is now we're now this is what we're doing. This is what we have to be doing. And exactly, listen, we have to start talking. But I will share this, if you don't mind. There is I did have some experiences, and I just like in this same spirit, sometimes people could probably take advantage of that, in my opinion, and in my experience, because I did enter into discussions and TV interviews. I joined Israeli TV and spoke about the Saudi position a lot of the times, and I really believe in this aspect that, like, okay, I could do what's in my power. And unfortunately what I felt was like people were, some, I can't say all, there've been some good journalists that I met, and they were fantastic, but some just didn't really care about what I had to say. The only thing they cared about was the fact that I was Saudi. And the fact that it was like, the Saudi Arabian is here. Hello, Saudi Arabian guy. How are you? So Saudi Arabian, can you listen, I know Saudi Arabian. I'm here to talk about the position, the complexity of the situation. Tell us, Mr. Saudi Arabian, how can you think about normalization and Saudi? And I'm like, listen, okay, I understand the situation. Okay, we have to start focusing on the things that we address this. Okay, Saudi Arabian guy, can you? And I was like, listen, I don't think they're really listening to me. So it was at times, I think, very difficult to I think I began to sense who is probably using me for my identity, and who is genuinely having a discussion. Who's genuinely
it's hard to pull those two apart, because on the one hand, your identity is a very strong factor in this discussion, right? Because you come from a very influential country in the Muslim and the Arab world, and it has a lot of say, it has a lot of sway into how things are done in this region. And on the other hand, who gives a shit, right? Like it's more about what you know and what you think. That's actually more important. So I don't exactly know how to tease it out, but the thing is, the conclusion that I come to with these things is I don't edit anything, and I just let the audience listen to and decide and come to their own conclusions, because it's not fair to you to then just edit your stuff out and perhaps take things out of context. And even if you didn't articulate yourself correctly or the way you wanted to, whatever, right? It's still you, right? It's not me doing the mischaracterization for you. But so in that spirit, man, I mean, before this war broke out, there was all this talk about. Now I'm going to be that Israeli guy who says, "What about normalization?" Right? But in all seriousness, right? In all seriousness, there was a lot of talk, and then the war broke out, and then all of a sudden, for reasons that I don't quite understand, there's all this discussion that it's been put on ice. But again, I never understood that rationale that Iran, provoked, and Hamas provoked this war to end the process of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia, because still the strategic rationale is the same today, perhaps even stronger today than it was before October 7th, right? Which is, namely, you have all these forces that are uninterested in peace with the status quo of countries that exist in the region right now. And now we know that they're very, very serious about it, and they really, really do mean what they say, and they threaten all that, and specifically countries like Israel and Saudi Arabia. So why not formalize the alliance? The stuff that's going on behind the scenes anyway. I don't get that at all. But tell me, where am I wrong in my thinking?
No, it's not wrong. It's there was indeed a lot of momentum building towards this normalization. The
Mm-hmm.
Saudi position towards normalization is an incredibly elusive, complex, very long, drawn out one. Saudi was willing to normalize relations with Israel since the early 90s. This is what, you know, a lot of
Hmm.
people kind of tend to overlook. And so,
Okay.
but it's how they articulate this. So the Saudis
Mm-hmm.
were always saying they've made their strategic position to make peace with Israel from even the late 1960s. You know, and a lot of
Hmm.
people like to say, you know, that they're sworn enemy, or I won't say sworn, they're sworn to go to war with each other. You know, this is not the reality, and not the depiction of Saudi, and nor the Saudi calculation. However, what the Saudis always have
Okay.
said is, okay, we're willing either to make peace with Israel. This is kind of from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And then in the 90s, they were saying we're willing to normalize relations with Israel. So look at how, you know, that evolved. So from the peace to the evolved. But there has to be something on the Palestinian issue. There has to be a Palestinian state.
Mm-hmm.
To be a just solution. This. So that structure of we're ready to do this once this happens, we're ready to do this if this happens, has been actually very consistent for a long time. And I think in 2002, something that probably some people are beginning to hear about, probably others didn't hear about before, or not as much, is the Arab Peace Initiative. So the Arab Peace
Mm-hmm.
Initiative in 2002 stipulated normalizing normal relations. It was based on the Saudi plan, which is a month before, which is normalization, but then it went to the Arab Peace Initiative, which is normal relations. Anyways, the semantics is something different. But anyways,
Mm-hmm.
they were willing to. There was always this extending of the hand. Now Israel extended also its hand, but not the Palestinian issue, circumnavigating the Palestinian issue. Let us address the issue, and then from then on, this could be something that could solve the issue. Let's address this. Now, this logic. So a lot of people look at, for example, Iran, and they say that's the reason why they're going to normalize relations, and this has been debunked. This is not how Saudi kind of operates. This idea of the enemy of my enemy is
Okay.
my friend. It isn't.
Hmm.
It's not congruent with the Saudi calculation towards Israel. Instead, I think
Okay.
Saudi Arabia made, well, probably normalized relations with Iran last year, because from the Saudi perspective, addressing Iran, re-establishing the relationship with Iran, changing the frame and the understanding of the relations from antagonism to cooperation, is in its strategic interest, and addressing its security concerns with Iran rather than aligning itself with Israel to confront it. Because I think confrontation with Iran has become something too costly. This is too costly. And secondly, if there is this open military cooperation between Saudi Arabia, Iran, or the Gulf, this will put even a bigger target on Saudi Arabia, either from people who domestically, or even from, because who's Iran now? You have all these different militias everywhere that are undisciplined, very difficult to control, and they'll just start firing all the normalizers, the new Arab Zionists. Because this is when I was saying in the mid 90s, when we were attacked by
Mm-hmm.
terrorism, they were accusing Saudi Arabia of, quote unquote, aligning with the Crusader Zionist alliance. So
Hmm.
it's it's also a security concern, hence why the balancing. Now, when it comes to, that was just a long background. But when it comes to the normalization now, I think Saudi Arabia realized, okay, normalization is in its interest, but it cannot happen just with no cost. There has to be something. What that thing is
Mm-hmm.
in Saudi's position is not clear, because it's always whatever the Palestinians say, whatever they deem good enough, we will then accept. This was always the Saudi position. As a result, there is always this passivity. People are always saying, why can't Saudi Arabia just say precisely what they want? It's not. It's always up to them. Now, Saudis don't want to interject themselves into the Palestinian-Israeli dynamics too much, or actually not at all, so they stay away from it. So as a result, there's a lot of fogginess around what the Saudi position is in regarding this issue. Now, after 2020, after the Abraham Accords, something has happened, which is it shifted the burden of concessions from Israel and what they could do for the Palestinian issue to what the United States will give. So as a result, this is why now there's another area of negotiation. So now there's an aspect that was being negotiated on the Palestinian issue, but there's also an aspect that was negotiated on the Saudi American issues. Like, well, what are you going to give us for normalization with Israel? So So here they made their statements. Their three kind of statements was that from the United States, from the demands. So a security treaty with Saudi Arabia, nuclear cooperation, and I think more weapons, access to weapons. Access to weapons for me is something secondary. It's really the two things of nuclear cooperation and the security treaty. Now, Saudis firstly demanded kind of an Article 5, like NATO. And I think the United States said this is a lot. This is too much to give. The nuclear cooperation seems like something that's tangible. And then the Saudis also wanted something significant on the Palestinian issue. This was before. So here there was two aspects that were fluid operating at the same time. So while people were saying, man, it was, we were in discussions of negotiation, I think personally, and I think others also believe this, it was already an uphill situation. It was already difficult to get anyway, the path to normalization, because there were just too many variables happening at the same time against the backdrop of an American election season. So they didn't, they were also, this negotiation was up against an American election season. And the question was, to what extent can they get this before the American election? Now,
Jesus, I think that's so complicated.
Yeah. And so you have a lot of things that are operating at the same time. Now, this is why I looked at language, was because therefore this position that Saudi is doing or having is creating a contingency. It's creating a contingency in its position. So what are the Saudis doing? It's really up to what's happening here. What are the Saudis wanting here? It's really up to how this thing happened. And that's how the Saudi position is. That's why its strength is sometimes in its passivity, and it's waiting. It's in a wait and see moment, seeing what unfolds here and seeing what unfolds there. What can be obtained here? What can be obtained there alongside its interest? And a lot of things have to align. And so it's very difficult to see, okay, how was this going to align anyway? Now, October 7th happened, and I'll be very honest with you, it was a devastating situation, because I think a lot of people thought something will happen, but nobody, I think, expected it to be this horrendous and tragic, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And I think too many people were looking at the Saudi point of view of the normalization. They were focusing too much on Saudi-Israeli normalization, not enough on what the Saudis were saying about, listen, there's an explosive situation on the horizon here. We need to really address this issue. There's a problem. And it goes back again to the issue that we were talking about before, is that too many people from abroad are the ones looking at what they want and pick and choose what Saudis are saying, what Saudis aren't saying, what Saudis are thinking, how are we, and it's becoming something very, I think, keeping me up, to be honest with you, because I'm just, I'm questioning why do people not want to listen to us? What's making us not listen to or taken seriously when we make these statements? Now, is it because they hear something different below? Is it because they misinterpret something? We have, we have a tendency to balance these positions through sometimes using, a fake, not a fake language, a vague language. We want to balance our position because there's too many spheres that we don't know what's going to happen. So we have to be clear. And I think, I'm sorry, not be overly clear. And therefore, this gets interpreted or misinterpreted. And then there's also a situation where we are also politicized domestically in Israel and in the United States.
Right.
And this is one thing that I wrote about recently, is that, you have people also always saying, don't worry, no, the Saudis are coming. Be careful. Stop. 1 second. No, the Saudis are with us. And this is what Netanyahu is saying. And he's trying to use the Saudi card to alleviate pressure domestically in Israel and to say, no, the Saudis are with us. Don't just.
And it's such a potent card too, because deep in the Jewish psyche is this deep longing to be accepted by the rest of the world. And what a statement that would be if the Saudis made peace with Israel. It's like, oh my God, the bastion of Islam, right? The ones that have given us so much trouble in the last century. They're now we're friends. Wow, right?
Yeah.
I mean, just look at how the Israelis, how they flew like crazy to the UAE after the Abraham Accords. Seriously, right?
Yeah.
It's rooted very deep in our psychology. This want, this longing to be accepted. But it's I mean, what you described is, there's so many different threads.
Yeah.
And each one hinges on how that is presented domestically, right? So I can imagine Biden at the beginning of his presidency being so anti-MBS, right, for the Khashoggi murder, and then now all of a sudden, giving the Saudis military aid and collaboration on the nuclear program. I don't even know what that means. Does that mean for weapons? Can you trust the Saudis? And that's like how that would be interpreted domestically is.
No, I didn't want to interrupt you, but that's really the discussion they're having, of course.
Yeah. But I mean, the same is true for Israel and the Palestinians right now. Like, for example, the Biden administration is trying to ram down everyone's throat a two-state solution, which is absurd to all of us in Israel. But I think even amongst Palestinians themselves, right? Just according to polling data, so why on earth are they doing that? The only answer that makes sense is Biden is scared that he's going to lose to Trump, and he has to, I don't know, perhaps appeal to the left wing of his base. I'm not sure, right? Because if you're looking for common sense in that strategy, I don't see it, right? But I was actually curious though about one of the things you said, that that Saudi policy dating back to the 60s is to normalize relations with Israel, and that was predicated on Israel compromising or doing, I guess, adopting whatever Arab peace initiative to create two states with the Palestinians. But I think the flaw there, from my perspective, is that it's the same as Biden is the same flaw that Biden is making right now, which is yes, happy to have two states and live alongside a Palestinian state, so long as the story that the Palestinians tell themselves isn't one that ends in the destruction of the Jewish state, right? And I think that was always the objection to these plans by, say, the right-wing part of the country for so many years. And I wonder actually if the Saudis aren't making the same mistake by normalizing relations with Iran, because again, Iran, their whole raison d'etre is exporting the Shia revolution. And I mean, if you just take note of what that means in practice, it means destabilizing the country from within, and then having some proxy in that country just take over things and essentially become a client state of Iran. So why do you think normalizing relations with Iran is a smart move from the Saudi perspective?
It's an interesting question, because I think, just like what you mentioned, that there are some Palestinians that will say, we've heard them time and again, some of them say, no Jewish state whatsoever from the river to the sea. Just like how there's some Israeli extremists who also say from the river to the sea also. And just like Modric, who had a map recently, it didn't have from the river to the sea. It had Saudi Arabia in it, and from Iraq to the sea. And this is so this is literally the map that he had, and parts of Saudi, and actually Saudi Foreign Ministry made a massive kind of fuss about this. So here it's very important to, I think, maintain an attitude, a particular attitude, in saying who in the Palestinians, just like what we're saying who in the Israelis, just like what we're saying who in the Iranians. Okay, so all the Palestinians, do they all say, no, we want this, we want no Jewish state? No, it would be unfair to say this, because there are people that are pragmatic, that really want some peace. And it's the same thing that we can say in Israel. Now, when it comes to Iran, exporting the revolution is a very touchy point, because it is actually mentioned in one of the doctrines that they have, or their constitution, that the IRGC is tasked with spreading the ideology of the revolution, etc. So while exporting the revolution isn't mentioned explicitly, that aspect. Now, however, anybody that looks at Iran, the domestic politics in Iran, also finds an immense amount of complexity there, that they're also not monolithic in how they view their relations with the region, because they too have their fair share of extremists, and they also have people that want to live in cooperation with the region, but they're operating within a system that's difficult. So there are pragmatists in Iran, and this is how people view this issue. And no, they're actually saying messages like, okay, listen, we can't keep doing this. We can't have this extremist stance. So you see this, for example, from the 80s under Khomeini, so the leader of the revolution. When he died, Rafsanjani then was the president, and he was then extending his hand to the Arab world and saying, no, let's reevaluate our relations together. Let's work together again. When he, I think, left in 1997 under Khatami, their president, that was perhaps one of the most stable times in Arab-Iranian relations, because that's when you see, even with the United States, and even he extended his hand to the United States when he invited people to have a wrestling match, and called it, I think, the cooperation of civilization or something. So here, and it was also in Khatami that extended messages willing to recognize Israel as a state. It was under Khatami there. So who in Iran are we talking to? So you have a system in Iran that is devised to maintain the regime, and devised to, one balances the other. And then you have kind of the military, and then you have the IRGC, and then you have kind of the pragmatists, which are in the foreign policy, and the presidency, the Institute of the President. And they kind of all go back to the supreme leader. And of course, in the supreme leader, he has his own politics to understand, because it's sometimes being in isolation is not in their interest. So here, one of the challenges that people faced in dealing with Iran is who we deal in with Iran. But we know that there are pragmatists there, that there can be some sort of resonance, that we can work, but it's very difficult. It's very, very difficult to put our finger here, because while the president may say something, the IRGC can do something else, either in Iraq or Yemen or etc. Now, how can we then change this? So this is where the Saudi challenge was. So let's change the relationship from using the stick into using the carrot. And that's what I think the Saudi strategy was. Now, here, it needed a reframing of the relationship. It needed, it can't use the carrot when it's in a context of conflict. So therefore, reframing the relationship from conflict to cooperation by normalizing relations with Iran. And therefore kind of, having this dialogue. And I think in this particular war, what they have shown is that actually, in my opinion, Saudi Iran have actually shown that this relationship, this normalization, has proven dividends for Saudi Arabia, because none of the proxies fired anything on Saudi Arabia. None of the rhetoric came out and saying, these Saudis are aligned with the United States in this. The Houthis, for example, were saying, hey, who we've been at war with for 7 years, hey, we are looking forward to working with the brothers in Saudi Arabia and to reaching a peace deal with Saudi Arabia. So you see here that Saudi calculation and its security interests is different than how Israel views the region. And this is why I claim that, okay, the notion of a Saudi-Israeli military alliance, this doesn't work. There's a different way. They're not on the same page. Now, they may have the same interests, or they may have the same goals or source of security issues, but dealing with it is completely different. And one of the things that I think even that will complicate issues is that if or when there's normalization between Saudi Arabia and Israel, it depends who is going to be in the president, the prime minister. But I suspect someone like Bigi will even complicate the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because then he'll say, you see, Iran, be careful. These Arab countries are with us now, and we could strike you from anywhere in the Gulf. You're outmaneuvered. You're out this. And that's what Saudi does not want. So, because this is the perception, Saudis know that Iran, or the Iranian lens, views Saudi Arabia as two things: part of an axis, part of the axis of part of the anti-Iranian axis. Therefore, so they're conspirators against us, or they view us as being occupied territory by the United States. This is the perception that some of these people have.
Okay.
Saudi Arabia doesn't have that agency. So by Saudi Arabia saying, listen, we're not here, we're not with them, we're not with these people, we have our own strategic interests, and our strategic interest is to work with you. And by the way, there's a lot of cooperation that happens between Saudi Arabia and Iran before. There's been security deals, there's been security signatures before, and or signings before. So the calculation of this as addressing the security interest is different between Saudi Arabia and Israel.
But then why place access to weapons and nuclear collaboration with the United States as a prerequisite for normalization with Israel? Is that link with the Iranian issue, or are those two separate things?
Maybe, but I think for Saudi Arabia, it's because whoever is looking at Saudi Arabia now, this is a good point. Who's ever looking at Saudi Arabia now will immediately see Saudi 2030. I think we've spent a lot of times talking here about Saudi Arabia, and I'm glad we didn't talk about 2030 yet, because or we came to it because a lot of the discussion is about 2030. But it's true. I think now with Saudi Vision 2030, it's a vision that, in my opinion, is about reestablishing or restructuring its economy, because Saudi has kind of been dependent on oil too much. Its oil economy is trying to move away from its oil-centric economy, and it understands that, okay, in order for it to be this hub that it wants to be, in order for it to be kind of this haven and this destination of economy, destination of investment, destination of a great deal of tourism, it needs to restructure its economy. And one of these things is that, part of the diversification of the Saudi economy is by having nuclear power to generate the Saudi economy. It doesn't want to use oil enough. or doesn't want to use oil as much, and understands that, okay, the relationship with oil, we're going to have to change this relationship. So that's one thing. So when it comes to the Saudi aspect,
Mm-hmm.
and this is in my research, I could say, I don't like to say this, but years of research. I mean, 10 years, 12 years of research on Saudi foreign policy towards Israel. See, I always said
Mm-hmm.
Saudi policy towards Israel, what the Saudi discourse about Israel, Saudi statements regarding Israel. Not much Saudi Arabia
Mm-hmm.
with Israel. Not much. Now, I can't say Saudis and Israelis don't meet unofficially. I think that is clear where they could meet. This is some, but for me, this is not the interesting point. This happens. It's very difficult to really pinpoint. It's easy to deny. So it's, for me, I look at the Saudi policy. The Saudi policy is very fascinating
Okay.
because the main point is that the main audience when it comes to Saudi policy towards Israel is actually in the United States. The discussions regarding,
Oh.
the discussions regarding Israel from Saudi Arabia is to the United States. They're the main kind of interlocutor. And as a result, why? Is it because you send a wink to Israel and say, let's do this? Or is it to maintain better relations with the United States? And you see
So
here,
weird.
yeah, you see, it's a very complex issue. You see here, historically, this is why they've been very pragmatic, and they've said since the late 60s that they're willing to have peace with Israel, but we have to sort this issue. Why? Because it was in Saudi's interest to have good relations with the United States.
Mm.
As a result, their image had to be very good, but they had to articulate their image in a particular way. And that was, for me, what was very fascinating. So here, it's unsurprising now that the demands that the Saudis want for normalization has to have an American element to it too.
Okay. Yeah, it's still a little difficult for me to wrap my mind around it fully, because it's as you said, right? It's ostensibly about Israel, but it's actually about the Americans.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Which is a weird it's a weird conversation. It'd be like I'm talking to you, but I'm actually talking to your dad.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, you're right. You're right. And this is what makes the Saudi policy towards Israel very difficult to understand, sometimes very elusive. Because I'll tell you what it is. Saudi-Israeli relations is best off understood as more close to a trilateral relationship than a bilateral relationship.
Mhm.
Because it's at the United
Yeah.
States. They're the ones that are there. They're the ones that are, okay, communicating this, okay, what the Saudi position is. You need to, and we've seen that, I think, more officially now, openly. So even leading up to October 7th, and when people say, the Saudi communication is, I think the Saudis even recently said, we communicate to Israel through the United States. Now, 2 years ago, they would have never said that. 10 years ago, that was just, I mean, yeah, you wouldn't hear a Saudi official say that. We speak to Israel through the United States. It's not. It's difficult to see that. But I think what has happened in the past year is that it actually shed light on what has been happening, communicating discreetly before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It actually struck me while you're describing this, that you were complaining before about other people debating and arguing and screaming at each other about what's going on to the people in this region. And there's something similar about the way that the Saudis conduct their, and the Americans for that matter, conduct their foreign policy about the Middle East, because they're trying to shape things on the ground here, right, with Israel Palestine. But their audiences are somewhere else. Like
Yeah.
it's we're just the playground, but really the real business is far away from where we are right now. And a lot of, as far as I can tell, a lot of the public discussion, like for example, I see Piers Morgan, he invites on people to have these debates about Israel Palestine. It's
Mm.
usually one American and one, I don't know, or another American. Which I get it, for the sake of language, that makes sense. But it feels like those guys are just pandering to their specific audiences.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Yeah.
not really at all
Yeah.
impacted by the things that they say.
Yeah.
So but it's interesting, like that kind of parallel also exists on the on the
Yeah.
highest stage in the world.
Yeah.
But so tell me, go ahead. Sorry.
No. I was saying it's interesting. You're right.
Tell me, you mentioned 2030. I think we should just close with this.
Okay.
What is that exactly? Because I have a little bit about it, but just like these huge futuristic towns and stuff. But what's that about?
Well, you're on the right track. You're on the right track. So 2030. So you have the Crown Prince in April 2016. Kind of stood in front of a podium and kind of announced that now the new horizon for Saudi Arabia, something called 2030. And in this 2030, Vision 2030, this is where Saudi Arabia, and according to what he says, is that will reach its full potential or capacity by 2030. He's always made the claim that Saudis, for example, we weren't investing in ourselves enough. We've had opportunities to reinvest in the country, and we were lethargic. And he's right. Some of these things that we're doing now, of restructuring the economy, of trying to take our economy from an oil-based economy to an investment-based economy, a tourism-based economy, a more diverse economy, should have been taking place 20, 30 years ago, not now. And as a result, you see a great deal of expediency and urgency in trying to change this. So there's an economic element to this. And just to be more also clear, there's also a social element to this. So you mentioned earlier that, okay, women, for example, couldn't drive. And that was one of the things that, many people would argue against Saudi Arabia, is that how can women not drive? And now under this vision, women had to drive. Women had to drive. And there was an empowerment. Because quite frankly, the workforce here was a great deal of very talented, capable people were women. But they had social constraints and in front of them a lot of the times. So a lot of these social reforms that were taking place was really to empower women, and also to get to build a working environment that is congruent towards this vision. So whoever used to go to Saudi Arabia before, they would see men's section, women's section. Every restaurant, family section, they would call it family section, and then men's section. And now you don't see that any longer, for example. Now, I personally wish that stayed. Okay, not stayed for segregation, but I wish that stayed to see kind of a historical kind of aspect, that this is kind of part of our history, that there were women had to be here and men had to be here. Personally, this is for me, because when I walk around a lot in historical places, you see like, oh, this used to be. But this is what used to happen, is that women and men would never work with each other. They wouldn't go out with each other.
Whoa.
And women couldn't travel unless they had a male guardian. Couldn't travel as in abroad, not leave the house or etc. So this all had to change. And all of this is basically designed to elevate Saudi Arabia and make it a new Saudi Arabia with that is becoming a regional, I want to say a global hub of investment, of tourism. And that's why you have these, for example, futuristic cities now. So, for example, one that's close to top of the Red Sea, close to Aqaba, is Neom, for example. I'm sorry, there's a futuristic city or region called Neom, and in it is called the Line. So it's like 170 miles or something, or 170 kilometers of just a city that's just a pure line, and that's like, I don't know, 800 meters wide or 2 kilometers wide, I think. So it's interesting. It's very out of the box.
That's
But
like that's the kind of thing that if you're a 16-year-old boy and you have all the money in the world, you're just gonna think up shit like that, you know?
but what's going to happen is going to probably bring people in, and that's what they care
Yeah,
about.
fuck yeah, I want to see that.
That's what the Crown Prince actually is saying. He's like, listen, people could say all these bad things about us, but if it's going to develop my GDP, then I'm happy with it. I don't care. So for
Oh,
example, Saudi started to
I
invest.
didn't mean it. I didn't mean it in a critical way. I think
Oh
that's
yeah, yeah,
it's just such a mind-boggling thing. Like
yeah,
only a
yeah,
16-year-old boy with a lot of money
yeah,
could dream that up. But yeah, for
yeah,
sure. I'd
yeah,
love to
yeah,
see it.
yeah. And so for example, football. So recently, when he gave a
Mm.
discussion on Fox, so Saudi now, because they're using all this oil money that they have, and then they're saying, listen, we can't just keep spreading it to people and just give it and subsidize people. We have to start
Mm-hmm.
now investing in the private sector and allow the private sector to do the heavy lifting for the economy also, because it's not sustainable
Mm-hmm.
any longer. So that's why this whole logic now and philosophy and ethos is very economic driven. It's an economic driven foreign policy. And this
Right.
is also another thing where here it's very fascinating. So what the Saudis realized is that this region, or Saudi Arabia's very lofty uh, economic goals, cannot be achieved in a regionally turbulent atmosphere.
Mm.
There needs to be regional stability in order to achieve this, and that is the kind of carrot that they're using with Iran. That's the kind of carrot they're using with others to say, okay, listen, we need to work together, and if you want a piece of the pie, you're going to have to do your part.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So a couple of things. One is that when you're talking about these kinds of cultural transformations from a conservative society, more closed, I would say, to the innovations of the rest of the world, is it enough to say that a top-down approach of, okay, now Saudi Arabia is open for all this stuff, and bring the smartest people from around the world to help us build this new economy, or does it need a deeper, more profound shift in the culture, such that, in other words, my question is more like, does innovation come hand in hand with an open society? Now, I know that freeing women to do more
Yeah.
things in society is one step in the way, but is that synonymous with an Islamic culture? Can you have an open society that can debate any idea, which is a prerequisite for innovation, and can you have that in an Islamic civilization?
Well, I think the quick answer is yes, you can have it in an Islamic civilization. But I think when it comes to the Saudi context, this is where they're going. They're kind of they're reestablishing their relationship with the religion also, and that before it was viewed, especially after 1979, it was viewed as there was they used to call it the Renaissance period, or the awakening period, the Sahwa, where it was people that were beginning to really propagate a particular form of Islam, an interpretation of Islam, not even a form of Islam, but an interpretation of Islam that was very insular, not very accommodating to others. And I think now there is a tolerant vision of Islam that's taking place in Saudi Arabia, and they're working hard to try to reestablish this kind of tolerant relationship with Islam, because all of this could be religiously consistent, and then there's debate. And the Crown Prince actually mentions this, that listen, people may not agree with everything I have, but as a head of state, I am also the head of the establishment of religion here, and
Oh, wow.
therefore, I am saying that maybe parties concerts that happens, DJ Tiesto talking about meet me at the hotel lobby, etc., etc. These things, they may seem religiously inconsistent, but as a leader, for me, the negative aspect, so long if this is going to bring me a great deal of jobs, I am religiously obliged to do this because it's serving the benefit of the people. So you see, it's like in this religious kind of interpretation, there's a broadening of the religious interpretation here. And so when it comes to the religious aspect, it's because religion is also very, very diverse. A lot of people think it's very just closed-minded. It's also it's a fluid situation. There's a lot of aspect based on principles, not on just details, and that's actually one of the things that I look at in my research is how Saudi fatwas. There have been Saudi fatwas that have legitimized cooperation with Israel in the early 90s.
Oh wow, really?
Yeah.
That's wild. That's not something you hear about.
There's a lot that we don't hear. There's a lot.
Yeah.
Because
is it true that MBS has cut down funding for I don't know what the stream of radical Islam is. It Wahhabi or Salafi in mosques around the world? Has he cut down on their funding?
No. Well, there's a lot of funding that was cut for everything. But I think one of the things that he was doing is that so Wahhabi is a term maybe we don't like here in Saudi. It's a very obvious term, and don't worry, but a lot of people think it's but it's something that we also say. What do we mean by Wahhabi here? But we could have that discussion for a different day. But yes, I mean, it was because of this restructuring of the economy. The subsidies could no longer happen. That was subsidized. All these schools that were given, teachers that were paid, schools that were open, education systems that were funded. This is just no longer able to happen. Instead, a great deal of the money that Saudi has is allocated to reinvesting in the economy rather than just to spread everywhere. But this also has to be done in a balanced way too. And that's why, again, it's in a constant state of balancing and not really just a pure kind of, a complete kind of cut off of all these things. So it's an interesting kind of process that's taking place. But I think overarchingly, they're cutting off all these things, and because they it's focused on 2030 and restructuring the economy, and that's where Saudi Arabia is heading.
Yeah. So, I mean, just to, I think that we should wrap this up, but it's what's so fascinating about this conversation. The sense I get from you is that, while Saudi-Israel normalization is probably unlikely in the short term, the long-term trends for Saudi Arabia are very encouraging, I would say. Not just for Saudi Arabia itself, but also just relations between the West and Islam.
I agree.
And I think that's awesome. That's why.
That's
great. Music to my ears.
Yeah. We have to. Here in the, we hope so. I mean, it's very heartening for me as Saudi. I think when I was here as a high school student, seeing how people perceive others differently. Before, I remember people viewed everyone else very suspiciously, just like how people viewed us suspiciously. But but now that is slowly changing through traveling, interacting, through doing these kind of things where we're meeting and talking and understanding about each other. So hopefully this will lead to just more good stuff, hopefully, and more peace in the region. Personally, this is my real intention is to see a real peaceful solution to all the problems in the region, and that would be my dream.
Amen, brother.
Amen, man. Amen.
Thanks for doing this, man. Aziz.
My pleasure.